Good afternoon and welcome to Killers, Kings, and Clowns, our regular podcast featuring John William Toohey, Camillus Robinson, and myself, Paul Whitcomb. Today we have three very special guests. A. Brad Schwartz is a writer and historian. Allan Collins is a New York Times bestselling author of original mysteries. And we also have Scott Sroka. And let's talk a little bit about who these gentlemen are. As I said, Brad Schwartz is a writer and historian. Max Collins, a New York Times bestselling author who co-authored Road to Perdition with him. It was made into a major motion picture starring, of course, Tom Hanks. They also penned Scarface and the Untouchables, Al Capone, Eliot Ness, and the Battle for Chicago. Scott Sroka is an investigative attorney with the U.S. federal government in Washington and the grandson of Agent Joe Leeson, one of the Untouchables. Today's subject, Scarface and the Untouchable, Al Capone, Eliot Ness, and the Battle for Chicago, an account of the efforts by Treasury Prohibition Agent Ness and his colleagues and sometimes rivals. These authors thoroughly detail how Capone rose to power, first in New York, then Chicago. Ness and Capone, both first-generation sons of immigrants, sought the American dream. The authors recount how Capone, who was the model for gangsters played by Edward G. Robinson and James Cagney in many, many golden era flicks, and Ness, the model for Dick Tracy, took firm hold in popular culture. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. I just have to offer a minor correction. I was not involved in the writing of Road to Perdition, sadly. It was a bit before my time. But we have co-authored two books.
There was an artist. That's the confusion. Richard Piers Rayner was because it was a graphic novel, the original version.
Oh, Max, I wanted to ask you quickly. You had a story about Dick Tracy and Ness.
Well, I had a long friendship with Chester Gould. Eventually, I am the second person who wrote Dick Tracy. I took over in late 1977 when Chester Gould retired. But I'd known him for several years before that, correspondence as a fan when I was a child. And so I got on. I was talking to him once at his home, and specifically asked him where he got the idea for Dick Tracy.
Yeah.
And he said, well, there was this very honest group of federal agents who, unlike the Chicago police, just could not be bribed. And they really took him. And I said, you're talking about Eliot.
Yeah. Eliot Ness.
Did we lose him?
I think we've lost his bandwidth. Said he had low bandwidth. Hold on.
Rose. Yeah, that's right. Brad, let me ask you if we can talk a lot about the book. Do you have a book handy? I don't have.
Yes. So this is the paperback
It's
that's currently available. I'm sorry.
Could you lean it in so people can see the? There you go. Scar. Great, yeah.
And this edition had some bonus features that were not in the hardcover. So paperback's the edition again.
Good. How is the book doing?
Very well. We've gotten some great reviews and some great
reviews. Yeah, great reviews. And they're saying that the research is phenomenal on the book, all over. That's great because you
put in the time. There is so much, as Scott knows. In trying to unravel the story of his grandfather. There had been so much secondary material that was contradictory, that was in some cases wrong, and so we tried as much as we could to go back to primary sources. So the source notes in this book are a significant portion of the weight of it, because newspaper articles, court records, Ness's scrapbooks. I went to something like a dozen states in the course of researching the book, trying as much as we could to, give you a sense of what these guys really were like.
Had you spoken to our last guest, Rebecca, from the Cleveland? You spoke to her?
Absolutely. She was one of the first,
Very knowledgeable.
Yes. Max and I both although we were separated by a few years, followed a similar path through our love of Dick Tracy into
Yeah.
this, which led me to his work, which led me to knowing more about Eliot Ness. And when
Yeah.
I became interested as a, in my mid-teens, wanting to know more about who this guy was, I started to go to events and to reach out to people. And Rebecca was probably, after Max, the first Ness person I sort of struck up a relationship, a friendship with. And I've been fortunate enough to meet a lot of really terrific people who have devoted a lot of efforts to trying to get the real story about this guy out. Rebecca, first and foremost, our friend Scott, Paul Heimel out in Countersport. There's a nice community of Ness aficionados out there, and it's great to see that take shape.
The $10 question. I've never gotten a straight answer. One camp says Capone never laid eyes on Ness. I don't know. Did they actually ever meet each other?
They did, and I can say that without equivocation, because as Scott knows, and he should feel free to jump in, Ness, near the end of his life, as I think you talked about in your last episode, was involved in the writing of a book that was ghostwritten for him by a sports writer named Oscar Fraley, but was based very heavily on his recollections, on his, scrapbooks, on this 21-page manuscript. And one of the things that Ness wrote, 21-page manuscript. And one of the incidents described in the book is that after Capone is convicted and he spends several months in the Cook County Jail before he's going to be sent to federal prison, Atlanta, Ness is involved in taking him from the Cook County Jail to Dearborn Station. And that is something that, had been disparaged. That claim, some revisionists had, sort of dismissed it, as they dismissed the entire book, saying that Ness was a glory hound, was somebody who wanted to claim credit for things that he hadn't actually done. And this was sort of the A1 example of that people would use. They say, well, Capone didn't know who he was and never laid eyes on him. Well, not only is Ness named in the Chicago Tribune of that day as being among the agents who brought Capone to Dearborn Station, but there's a photograph, and it's in the book. It's actually the frontispiece of the book that shows, here it is, that shows the two of them. Ness is right here, looking right at Capone. And there are two photographs actually that we found. That's one of the things. We added a second picture to the paperback.
Scott, you had mentioned that the first time we met, the photograph. Scott, I know you didn't write it, that Max and Brad did, but what sometimes competitors, they didn't get along well, the Untouchables with Ness?
Well, in fact, I think, they had a lot of respect for him, and they all came from different areas. And I think I mentioned the last time that, Ness, when he came into the federal service, was working for his.
Excuse me, gentlemen, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Because I'm getting no audio from you after I got kicked off of here.
Oh. What can we do, Cam?
I'm trying to see if there's anything with the setting. Stop videos. I don't.
Can he stay on video and call into the phone?
Yeah, I can. Should I send another invitation?
That's what I recommend.
Yeah. All right.
Stay on the video and then use a cell phone to call in. Is that right?
All right. Well, I'm gonna send out. I'm gonna kick him out and then text him and say I'm gonna kick him out and then send him another invitation.
Keep his video on, and then he should log in separately on a cell phone for the audio.
Yeah, that's a good idea, Cam. Can you send me your phone?
Don't kick the video out.
I'm not kicking anything out.
Let me move along while we do this.
Yes, go ahead.
Was there a competition between them? Is that what the problem was?
Well, these were human beings, so they did. These were ambitious guys. My grandfather, he served on a destroyer in World War I. And then when he came back to Indiana, he was basically doing manual labor on a railroad. But these were ambitious guys, and my grandfather and his brother-in-law Donald Cookin left Indiana. They went to Detroit to become prohibition agents, which at the time in 1928 was kind of a daring, adventurous thing to do. They weren't as organized as federal agents eventually became. And then my grandfather was sent to Detroit, where he fought the Purple Gang. And I think I've shown you, I have this family photograph of him and some of the other agents in Detroit. You can see some of them are holding axes and they're sitting on the back of a truck. And so it was a pretty rough and tumble life. And so to do it, I think you had to have a certain amount of physical stamina and just ambition. And so to maybe answer your question, I mean, these were ambitious guys. Some of them, had all kinds of their own personal problems that they had to leave and travel around the country to deal with during all this time. So I don't know that they were so much in competition
on this podcast, and I got thrown off. I mean, it.
Yeah.
Hold on.
You can hear Max.
And when I rebooted.
Brad, you brought up a point that we're both sons of immigrants. And I wrote about Roger Toohey and his nemesis Purvis. They came, all four of these guys were about the same age. Pre-World War I, the Lightning generation who didn't pull back, and they used psychology, with the new psychology, to reason away things. Do you think there was any similar, because prima facie, there didn't seem to be a lot of similarities between the really ethnic Capone, and then we've got the Norwegian?
Yeah, Norwegian.
Was there any relations between similarities at all, aside from that?
I mean, there were quite a few, actually. We were surprised at how parallel these guys' lives ended up becoming. They're about 4 years separated in age. Both the sons of immigrants. Capone's father was a barber, Ness's was a baker. They end up living while Ness is getting started as a prohibition agent in the mid-1920s on the same street in Chicago, South Prairie Avenue, in houses that are mirror images of each other, the two flats that are very common on the South Side. And they both sort of come from this ethos that was very much a part of this generation that you're talking about, which is sort of the professionalizing impulse, right? Capone is invested in the idea, his mentor, John Torrio, is taking these old forms of organized crime and bringing in this American corporate culture, and making it a business, making it a modern, streamlined enterprise. And Ness, is coming up at a time when it's, law enforcement means the old school beat cop who has a billy club and a gun, but not a whole lot of training. And Ness, he's the youngest of several children. He has 3 sisters who are older. And his eldest sister marries a guy by the name of Alexander Jamie, who finds his way into the what became the FBI, what was then known as the Bureau of Investigation, before getting thrown out because he had a difference of opinion with J. Edgar Hoover. But Jamie is one of these people who's very interested in the idea of professionalizing law enforcement in the way that Torrio and Capone are professionalizing crime, and saying that, you can be a cop in the way some people are doctors or lawyers. And so Ness, who idolizes his brother-in-law, Jamie, from a very early age, gets this idea in his head that he wants to be this new kind of cop, that he is going to change law enforcement. And he learns these ideas that he starts to implement as the leader of the Untouchables in Chicago. Later on, that's what he devotes his life to in Cleveland. But he's really trying to change law enforcement and make it a new, better thing.
I have 2 questions. I'll turn it over to Paul or Tim. One was, we've got what would today, they say $1 billion, but that was 20-something, probably $2 billion criminal empire, $1.5 billion, easy, in 1928, 1930. How much damage did Ness do?
Are you asking me?
In all fairness, to the beer end of it, because there were a lot of other enterprises.
The evidence suggests he did a a significant, particularly because of the time period that we're talking about. You know, the Untouchables, despite what you've seen on TV, were operational were raiding for a rather brief period of time between 1931 and 1932. They were formed in late 1930. So this is obviously, these are the darkest years of the Depression. The mob was already dealing with cash flow problems. And then you have beer is obviously their staple enterprise, right? Because I forget, it's in the book, but it costs like $2 per barrel to make, and it retails for 55 at Prohibition prices. So that's a huge markup. And a significant portion of that is going to go to paying off the cops and the Prohibition agents and the government officials. And if you start to take that away, very quickly the operation starts to break down. And so while Capone is dealing with the income tax prosecution and these other threats to his empire, he has the Untouchables going around shutting down these breweries at a very crucial time. And, you know, there's a lot of anecdotal reports. This is another quote that's actually in the Oscar Fraley, Eliot Ness Untouchables that we were able to find the original source for. But in 1932-33, one of Capone's former chief beer business people, Bert Delaney, was arrested, and he basically told the cops, "Why are you arresting me? Once I was in the Bucks, now the racket is done. Eliot Ness put Capone out, and everybody else is folding up." So combined with the Depression and what the Treasury Department was doing with the income tax investigation, Ness was hitting Capone in the pocketbook in a very significant way.
I want to ask you, you've explained these guys Scott explained they came from different backgrounds, blah, blah, blah. Why not? I mean, Ness could have paid, Capone, Ralph Capone, would have paid them really anything they wanted within reason. $1,000 a month would have been how much? 10,000 really today? I mean,
15,000 around there.
Pocket change for that. So aside, what do you think, was there another motive aside from integrity, or?
I think Scott answered this question for me. I had the same question, and I'd be curious to hear his thoughts on it.
Your microphone is off, Scott. Your microphone is off. There you go.
All right, I think it got turned off. We should probably tell Max to unmute himself too, because I didn't know that I was muted. You know, I mean, these guys were about law and order. They weren't teetotalers. They weren't moralists when it came to Prohibition. And the Untouchables weren't formed until after the streets of Chicago were already being riddled with bullets. Civilians were getting hurt and killed. Businesses were suffering. And it was really when the businesses like Sears Roebuck and other places started to, you know, get worried that nobody wanted to come to Chicago to do business, that the federal government stepped in. So, you know, it's really, it's just not true to say that these guys were somehow morally opposed to drinking or alcohol. It was really that they were for real law and order, and that they believed that the law was what keeps civil society together, and that Al Capone and the gangsters were literally ripping it apart, and people didn't want to go out downtown because they were afraid of getting shot.
And exhibition.
I would just only, if I could, add as well that, you know, we talked about Ness wanting to professionalize law enforcement, and when he was building the team of the Untouchables and sort of scouring the personnel files for people he could put on it, he chose men who shared this idea that it wasn't just, being a Prohibition agent wasn't just a job, it was a career. And they were in it for the long haul, and they were, you know, going to be lifers, and you know, met most of the Untouchables, my recollection.
And Brad, I like to say that you can, if you look at my grandfather, you can trace that development by the clothes that he had to wear to work. You know, I mean, his earliest pictures, you have him in a Navy uniform, then you have him literally in overalls and an engineer's cap working on the railroad. Then you have him wearing, you know, dirty coveralls and boots when he's an agent. By the time he goes to work for the alcohol tax unit, you know, he's wearing a suit and a tie and a hat. And he really is, he really kind of personifies the professionalization of federal law enforcement through the course of his career. And in fact, the reason that we have this picture, his daughter from his first marriage hated this picture because she said, my father wore a suit and tie to work, not dirty overalls. And so she gave my mother this picture because she didn't like it.
And so that's exactly right. And these are not the guys who were the first, couple of generations of prohibition agents in the early part of the 1920s, who were political appointees, who were in it for the graft. Certainly there were still plenty of those around by the time the Untouchables were getting formed, but the men Ness chose were in it for a very different reason. And that helps explain why they would resist these sorts of bribes.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I now can hear you, and if I may be repeating something that Brad said, so forgive me. But one of the reasons why I think they were quote unquote untouchable is that they're looking at the long haul. They're looking at the big picture of having a career and being professionals, as opposed to just getting a quick hit now as a young person. I don't know if you've made that point already, Brad, but that's a major part of that. That is kind of a missing element when the Untouchables are discussed. That they were untouchable because they viewed themselves as professionals in for the long haul in a government career.
Right. Who first called him the Untouchable? Where did the Chicago Tribune?
George Johnson, the prosecutor, as close as we can determine. It seems to have, well, there are different schools of thought on it. There's also, as I'm recalling from the book, there was a newsman on the Chicago Daily News, I believe, who may have started to use the term as a joke. The origins of it, as far as we can determine, actually was a reference to the Untouchables of India, because Gandhi was very much in the news in 1931, and it began.
Who ran naming people in the Underworld?
Sorry? Yeah,
this guy,
but it wasn't.
he worked on
The name. The idea was, if you think about the Untouchables, the lowest members of the Hindu caste system, that they're sort of the outsiders, the people who are seen as unclean or untouchable, literally. And that was how Ness and these unbribable prohibition agents were perceived, because if it's 1931 and you're not taking bribes and you're in law enforcement in Chicago, people are going to be suspicious of you. Your brothers in blue. And then it becomes the prosecutor, George Johnson, who says, no, this isn't, an insult or a joke. This is really a badge of honor. Because nobody can touch these guys. And he's the one who gives it to the press. And after the indictments in June of 31, that's the first time they're really publicized as the Untouchables.
Yeah.
Well, Brad, that's so important because
misgivings about the Untouchables being used as the title of this book, because of the confusion with Gandhi's Untouchables, and so one has to wonder how, if that Untouchables hadn't been attached to that television program, if it would have had the cultural purchase that otherwise, if it had just been the Capone unit or whatever.
Right.
We gave them a superhero type name that allowed them to get into the popular culture in an interesting way. And that name was never in the popular culture to that degree at the original go around. It was, we can find it here and there as a handy dandy headline thing generator for a few years. But people around town weren't talking about the Untouchables for years and years while that was going on. Just that's a myth.
These periods of American heroism or exceptionalism, these periods of American myth, I think that this is, you've actually keyed in on one, which is probably why the name stuck so well and why we're still talking about it years later, is we look at these exceptional individuals who did exceptional things in dire times, as it were, and it really draws the imagination. I think that's what propagated the TV series. I think that it's really, it's really a key time. It's just very, very interesting how everything came together, as you're saying, whether it's the publicity, the public interest, a lot of these factors contributed to bringing it forward in our public consciousness today.
Well, what is braver in the Depression than to turn down money?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, never mind guns and gangsters. When people are in bread lines and at soup kitchens,
Eating out of garbage cans.
Yeah.
You should talk to Brad about the soup kitchens, because that's a whole nother story. The famous Capone soup kitchens.
Yeah.
Right.
It's the idea that these guys could turn down a bribe for 1 month for what would be their entire year's pay.
Mm-hmm.
That's brave today.
That's better men than I.
Even more so, the Capone organization killed cops when they had to, and they would have killed them. I mean, that's a secondary factor, but had push come to shove, they had to be scared.
It's interesting, there's one of the things that the Ness Fraley Untouchables book does that has led people to discredit it is it jumbles events up, things that Ness was involved with before the Capone case. And one of those is this investigation in Chicago Heights, where he actually goes undercover as a corrupt prohibition agent, essentially, accepting bribes from bootleggers who were affiliated with the Capone mob in order to suss out the details of their operations to sort of win their confidence. And then they end up having this big raid in early 1929 and bringing the whole house of cards down. But that's a period where, especially if you're a corrupt, if you're taking the gang's money, that does away with any, protection honest law enforcement might have. Although, as you said, there are certainly some indications that there were threats even against people like George Johnson. But in that period, in 1928, 1929, certainly, when Ness is undercover, there's an incident where, he's haggling for a bribe, and he's with one of his agents who doesn't look Italian but can speak Sicilian, and overhears the gangsters talking about giving this annoying probation agent a knife in the back. So there were certainly periods in which he was there were times when the Capone mob was trying to scare him unsuccessfully, and there were periods when he was definitely in mortal danger.
There was a bomb I'm going off of memory, a bomb in a car, right?
That's in the Ness Fraley book. I think it's one of the few things we weren't able to independently authenticate. And Scott has done a lot of work on this as well, so maybe he can jump in. Certainly, the vast majority of events that are described in that book, even though they're novelized up, given some more color, they're verifiable in one way or another. There are a couple of attempts on his life that are...
Wasn't Couture, he was around, wasn't he?
Well, I think that would have been Belcastro.
Yeah, that would have been James Belcastro, but Couture was around. He would have been younger.
Yeah.
So there's a story in the second Fraley book. It's interesting because there are certain interesting details that it gets spot on. My grandfather really did love to cook, and when he was married to my grandmother and agents were coming over for dinner, he would do all the cooking and then tell my grandmother to put the apron on because he didn't want them all to think that he was. And there's a story in the second Fraley book, Last of the Untouchables, about my grandfather that says that he was a good cook and was cooking in his apartment, and that he went out to get some chili powder or something, and a grenade was thrown into his apartment. And so I don't know if we can verify about the grenade being thrown into his apartment, but there were definitely details in that book that were spot on, and somebody had a source that knew what they were talking about.
Well, the thing is, and this is something that Brad and I had to wrestle with in both of the books, is that you have these. Ness lived this life that was the stuff of myth, but he didn't conveniently live it in an order that sounded like a novel.
Yeah.
So that you have something like Chicago Heights, which precedes the Untouchables, which is probably far more dangerous and more cops and robberish than anything happened in the Untouchables. Their raids were effective, but pretty routine. They weren't really running into Tommy guns and all this kind of stuff. There were there were threats and there were attempts on their life. But as far as these big raids where they go in and guys with Tommy guns are waiting for them, that is totally Hollywood.
Yeah.
But so I can see Fraley with this person, Eliot Ness, who nobody really remembers anymore, just taking the stuff that's in the scrapbooks and in the few things that Ness was able to remember and write up, and saying, I'm just going to put them in the best order I could put them in to make an effective story. So that when Ness comes along and says, gee, don't mention that I have 3 wives. Could you put my current wife in this book? Sure, Eliot, that's fine. That won't hurt anything. It's because they didn't have a clue that we'd be sitting talking about this stuff in the year 2020. They thought we'd be on rocket ships. You know, they had no idea that this would be going on.
Yeah.
So I don't think we should try to hold these real people to some kind of mythic, heroic standards. The fact that this a family story about a hand grenade getting tossed into the window, I mean, that says it all, doesn't it? And it's not the kind of thing that would make it into history. But boy, it made it into memory, didn't it?
Yeah.
Sure. Gentlemen, there were a couple of other organizations besides the Untouchables that were not touched by Capone. The Secret Six, for example, Illinois State Police's attempt to take on Capone, the Chicago Crime Commission. Was there any kind of interaction at all between these very few groups of honest law enforcement that were actually trying to enforce the law without being touched by graft? Are you aware of did they interact with these people at all?
Absolutely.
Brad found all kinds of stuff out about the Secret Six that I think nobody ever found out.
Well, it's certainly the case that, Alexander Jamie, Ness's brother-in-law, after he transfers from the Bureau of Investigation to the Prohibition Bureau, that's why Ness becomes a Prohibition agent in 1926, because he's going to follow his brother-in-law wherever he ends up.
Right.
And then Jamie leaves in 1930 to become the chief investigator for the Secret Six, to head that attack on organized crime. And as Jamie's leaving, he very explicitly is setting up Ness to be chosen as the head of the Chicago Prohibition Office, even though Ness at that time would have been 27. Very young. He's had experience. He's had the Chicago Heights case. And he's been, Prohibition agent for 4 years. But Jamie, in the letter where he's asking that Ness be given this position, he's talking about making a coordinated effort between honest law enforcement and this sort of private vigilante group. The Secret Six, if people don't know, is essentially a detective outfit that is founded and funded by some of Chicago's wealthiest citizens, people like Samuel Insull, who are, as Scott was saying earlier, very concerned about the reputation for lawlessness and violence that Chicago is having. It's driving away business. There's a World's Fair coming in 1933. So they really want to clean the city up. They're very explicit about wanting to get Capone in jail before the World's Fair. And so Jamie has this plan where, if Ness is in charge of the Prohibition Bureau, Jamie's in charge of the Secret Six. We can work with people in the Treasury who were, very involved with the Secret Six as well. We can actually get this done. The Prohibition Bureau does not decide to make Ness the chief of the office. That doesn't happen for a few more years. But soon after, George Johnson has this plan that comes down, once the new president, Herbert Hoover, expresses interest in getting Capone put away for good. They resurrect this plan to build these small squads of agents who can go after the bootleg gangs who are handpicked, who can't be corrupted. And who does Jamie recommend but Eliot Ness, and the rest is history.
That's really fascinating. You may or may not know this. I have an office in Sterling, Illinois, 100 miles west of Chicago, and across the street from my office is this enormous mural of the Secret Six, all on motorcycles. And it's been there for many years because they hung out west of Chicago in order to protect their own safety. And so they're in the mythology, even out here. I don't know if you've ever I'll have to send you a picture if you've never seen it, Brad.
Please do.
But it's been there for many, many years. You might recognize Jamie. I don't know if you would or not.
Yeah, he was the public face of that organization after Robert Isham Randolph, who was sort of its director. and Jamie is the guy out there. One of several people, and Ness would have been one as well. Very consciously trying to offer in the press a public persona that would be the antithesis of Capone, because Capone by that time had become the public face of Chicago around the world, to the great consternation of a lot of people, and the federal government, George Johnson, a lot of people wanted to provide an alternative. Ness ends up becoming that alternative, and that's when Chester Gould picks him up, and this myth gets started. But it's this battle, not just with Tommy guns going on in the street, but in the press, in popular culture, trying to save the reputation of the city of Chicago.
Well, interestingly, when all these movies started to be made, there was a Secret Six movie. So the Secret Six, people may not have known exactly what it was because it was secret, but it did get out there, and you don't really have a movie that I know of that picks up on what Ness was doing. I mean, until Desilu got hold of it, that was not a major part of the myth. So you have a movie, you have the Undercover Man movie made by Joseph Lewis, which was basically doing the tax unit investigation very loosely, but doing it. Yeah. And you have stuff in the 30s even, and there's the one with Brad. What's
Special
the one
Agent
with Betty Davis? Is that
Special
the one?
Agent?
Special
Yeah.
Agent.
And so this was getting into the popular culture in very somewhat weird Hollywoodized ways, but in retrospect, it's interesting to look back on that period and see that Ness and his group were not part of that. They never got touched by that, with one exception, and that's Dick Tracy. But nobody was making the connection, not even Chester Gould, I don't think.
And just to emphasize that, because that's a really important point, and one that we try to hammer home in the book. We talked earlier about this myth that has arisen of Ness as a glory hound, as someone, because he became so famous after he died. Of course, he dies 5 months before the book is published, the Untouchables book in 1957. He doesn't see the hardcover, much less the TV series and the movies and all that, which make him, turn him into the hero of the Capone investigation, the only one anybody remembers. And so, the IRS investigators, the Treasury people, who are still around, people like Frank Wilson, who was heavily involved in the tax case. They are miffed and take their frustration out in some ways publicly. And that then gets repeated in the literature that, well, Ness is a glory hound, but nobody paid attention to the tax investigators. They weren't interested in the press. And I went to, Frank Wilson's papers are in Wyoming. They're at the American Heritage Center at the University of Wyoming out in Laramie. And a good chunk, at least a third maybe, of what's archived there is letters he sent to radio stations, TV stations, Hollywood, trying to get a television series based on his work or the work of the intelligence unit of the Treasury. He cooperated with Special Agent in the 1930s. Undercover Man that Max mentioned is, although he's called Frank Warren, it's based on articles that were ghostwritten for Wilson and Collier's in the 40s. So he had been out there very heavily self-promoting himself and trying to control how this story was being told. And then Ness ends up sort of leapfrogging him from unintentionally from beyond the grave. But I always think it's interesting that, one of the things that the Untouchables, the book, does is that Ness was always, whenever he's quoted in newspapers while he's alive, he tends to downplay the Untouchables, to say, well, we're just doing a job. The tax people, they were the ones who really built the case. We were just there to break up his income. He says this repeatedly. He's always giving credit to Wilson. The Untouchables book mentions Frank Wilson and Elmer Irie and the work the Treasury agents did. Wilson, in his memoir and his articles, he never talks about Ness, and is frankly disparaging of the Prohibition Bureau at several points. So that there was some bad blood between those agencies that has really distorted how these men have been characterized.
Well, talking about bad blood, Desilu, when they started producing, I'm sure you guys know this, when the Untouchables came out, Sam Giancana actually put a contract out on Desi Arnaz's life because he was so offended by the portrayal of Italians. Now that was pulled back by cooler heads, but the Italian American organizations were really upset with this TV show and the way it portrayed them.
We actually cover that in the new book, Scarface and the Mad Butcher. Pardon me?
Eliot Ness and the Mad Butcher.
Because the end of that book deals completely with how the Untouchables TV show happened and became an incredible coda to Ness's life. But going back to the idea of him as a press hound, there's something really interesting to me, which is that when he was kind of told, not kind of told, he was told when Capone was starting to, was arrested and indicted, that they wanted publicity for the first time. Before that, it had been pretty low key.
Yeah.
So you had Ness told to get publicity.
Yeah.
But Ness never put himself in front of a camera. He never put himself out there as like, I'm the face of the Untouchables.
Yeah.
He did not do that. Then a few years later, when he comes in, we're into the second book now briefly, when he goes to Cleveland, he's mandated by the mayor. He's mandated to use the Capone case to get publicity, and he's basically told if you can't fill the headlines because we have such a corrupt police force here, the police force has such a bad reputation. If you can't refurbish that reputation by leaning on your celebrity, and he was a kid. What was he, 32?
Right.
He would have lost his job. He would have been an asterisk, not a legend. And so the only time he was a glory hound, and where he got very close to a lot of reporters, was in Cleveland when he was mandated by the mayor to do so. And the only time in Chicago, correct me if I'm wrong, Brad, but I think in Chicago he had to be nudged to do what he did with publicity. Because
and there's
a lot more
in the personnel files of some of the Untouchables, which Scott was instrumental in uncovering. There are references to one of them. Seeger was very upset about how the Justice Department was essentially forcing them to get press attention, to build in this particular instance a case that he thought was not worth pursuing, simply for the sake of headlines. So again, this is a PR war as much as it is a gang war, and
we also, the agents all kept personal scrapbooks with all of the newspaper clippings that were appearing in the newspaper of the raids at the time. And Ness's scrapbook is in Cleveland at the Western Reserve Historical Society, but I just found my grandfather's scrapbook a couple of years ago, and it's huge. And what's interesting about it is that you can, first of all, he didn't keep scrapbooks of the rest of his career. So this was clearly something that they personally saw as an important assignment to them. And it also gives you some idea when you look at which of the raids he clipped newspaper stories from. You can get some idea about which ones he might have participated in. But it's a meticulously kept giant scrapbook that has survived since 1931. Of all of these original newspaper clippings that are carefully placed on the pages that he kept with him for his whole life and then passed down to his descendants.
Well, Scott, think about the late 20s and early 30s, and all of these names that we know so well today, Al Capone, but also Bonnie and Clyde, Dillinger, all of these names that are actually still household words. This was the news.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
This was what was going on right now. And that's how Dick Tracy started, because Gould was saying that's on the front page, I'm going to put it on the comics page. And most of his early villains were directly based on Pretty Boy Floyd and when Dillinger escapes from jail, he's got I think the character was Boris Arson escapes from jail with the fake gun, that Dillinger famously created. We look at it as myth, legend, popular culture, and fascinating history, but in reality, it was today. It was there today. And so I can imagine, Scott, that your grandfather would have known he was in the middle of history. He would absolutely have known, and on some level, these guys had to relish it.
I think Fraley's saving, asking for the rights to the book immediately. I mean, speaks to your point. I mean, he knew immediately he had a story there. I think there's something he said for it being the Wild West in a way too. You had this kind of thing going on in New York, and you had Thomas Dewey and you had Luciano in those trials, but you don't see what you had with the bank robbers and Al Capone and everything. And I know it's Chicago, but and there was a lot to do with Chicago and New York back then, but there's something about the Wild West to it. I think that it all speaks to what we seek out as Americans.
Can we see the two books again? We didn't introduce the second book well enough. Now this is
One.
The first one.
Book 2.
So why don't you just show us book 2 so we don't confuse our viewers? We want to maybe come a little bit closer so they can get the name of it. What do we got here? Eliot Ness and Matt Butcher. Tell us about that.
Well, this picks up where the first one leaves off. What happens to Ness essentially after Prohibition is over? He stays on with the Prohibition Bureau at a time when that's rapidly becoming a dead-end job. He, like his brother-in-law, he ends up crossing horns with J. Edgar Hoover, so the FBI is not an option, even though he's often misidentified as an FBI agent. Hoover wages this sort of quiet vendetta against him, even beyond the grave when the TV show happens. But he's stuck in what becomes the alcohol tax unit of the Treasury by the mid-30s. When he comes into Cleveland, when he's hired by this reform mayor, Harold Burton, to clean up a town that is one of the most dangerous in the country, that is very corrupt, that has a very a police force that seems beyond repair, dealing with a lot of issues that are still at the forefront of our national conversation today. And so Ness comes in, the hero of the Capone case, this 32, as was said, very young, someone who is really a bright shining light in this city at the time that really needs one. But right as he's beginning his career in Cleveland in 1934 to 1935, bodies start turning up, headless corpses, dismembered and cut up in various ways. About the only thing that ties all of them together is that they died because their heads were cut off. And Ness eventually, even though he's very interested in battling the mob, in reforming police, in dealing with issues of juvenile delinquency, he eventually gets dragged into this case that would not at that time have been recognized as a serial killer, because this is only 50 years after Jack the Ripper. They barely have a term for this yet. It was actually being developed in Germany at that time and hadn't reached the United States yet, the notion of a serial killer. Right. So this is something that Ness, he has all these ideas that he got in Chicago about what a modern police force should be. And they end up being put to the test by this case in ways that he would never have.
Well, it really, and I have to really credit Brad for this, because he's the one who really thought this through. But you have in Ness a guy who, yes, he wants to be a professional. He wants to professionalize law enforcement. He wants to be like a doctor or a lawyer. And he's very scientific. He's very forensics oriented. He's very into, as Brad mentioned, the juvenile delinquency, as root causes of crime, psychology, science. And he does not know what to do with a madman.
Yeah.
And that's what the story is, and that's what's fascinating about it. And he ducks it for some time, and when he does take it on, he doesn't do it in a very high profile way. It kind of sneaks into it does get into the papers, but it kind of sneaks in there. I think he may have known that he was up against something that, I don't know that he felt he was in over his head, but it was something unlike anything he saw in Chicago, anything he saw elsewhere. Because he's dealing with, the numbers racket. He's dealing with, crooked unions. He's dealing with crooked cops. He's dealing with juvenile delinquents. He's doing all of these things that are just sort of typical in a city even today. But they didn't know what to make of this.
And didn't he catch the guy? Maybe I'm wrong.
That's the question, isn't it? I don't want to think we want to spoil the
Yeah,
the end of the book. I will say he developed a very intriguing suspect, and there were some lie detector tests, and there was some intrigue, and this individual ends up sending Ness, very late in life, postcards, which are on display at the Western Reserve Historical Society in Cleveland. Max stumbled across them in his research for the Ness books, which he may talk about. But it's this, the book follows, it's the second half of Ness's life, after Prohibition, and follows him through to this point at the end where, he's getting postcards from this apparent madman. He's destitute. He's shunned by many of his former friends and associates, dies horribly in debt. And he dies just before he becomes a legend. And so it's this, this great American tragedy that ends up, with a sad ending, but at least he becomes an emblem for law enforcement.
True. Max, are you a native? I thought are you a New Yorker?
Pardon me?
Are you a New Yorker?
No, I'm from Muscatine, Iowa. I'm sitting in Muscatine, Iowa right now.
Oh, I was wondering because you did Road to Perdition, which is pretty much a Chicago story.
Road to Perdition, actually, the gangster John Looney, who's called John Rooney in the film, played by an unknown named Paul Newman, gave him a break, for the picture. He was basically the godfather of Rock Island, Illinois, which is 30 miles from my house. So that was something I had grown up with, and I had run into basically in research for the first of my Chicago novels, my character Nathan Heller. And I actually, and Brad helped me on this a little bit, but the most recent Nathan Heller book is, has to do with Cleveland, and it has to do with the Sam Shepard case, the one that became the fugitive, essentially. But Eliot Ness, the Eliot Ness story, in terms of my Nathan Heller story, is resolved. Is it fair to say it's a bit of a coda to what we do, Brad? There's a difference between, because I'm using Ness in a slightly fictionalized way, and it's slightly romanticized, far less I think than anybody else has done in popular culture. But we strip that away in these two books. I mean, this is the real Eliot Ness, take it or leave it. And there's much to admire, but he's not perfect.
No.
I mean, that was our guiding principle from the first book on through this one, was that with Capone and with Ness, we wanted to give you a sense of what it was like to be in the room with these guys, to put flesh on these bones, to, really characterize them. And there's a moment, just talking about the new one, there's a quote where he was giving an interview, and he's talking about his ideas of crime, and essentially making the argument that if you have a lot of racketeering and a lot of gangsterism in a city, you're also going to have a lot of rapes and, non-property crimes. Essentially, that all crime is alike. And if if you can bring the lid down, it's going to be better for everybody. And that really helped me understand how he just couldn't wrap his mind, as Max was saying, around this madman, around this killer. He's used to dealing with Al Capone. He's used to dealing with people who make sense. This guy doesn't. And he's trying to think, is he cutting off the heads to prevent identification? Like, what is going on?
Yeah.
And it really forces him, as a great antagonist does, really forces him to, challenge his assumptions, to stretch, and to, put these ideas of law enforcement to the test.
On the other hand, when he's up against his other nemesis, Capone, you have these two sons of immigrants, right? You have these two guys pursuing the American dream. It's just that they have two very different visions of what's proper in pursuing that dream. And in kind of fairness to Capone, I mean, he did grow up a different way than Eliot Ness did. I mean, Eliot Ness had for the era, a pretty all-American upbringing. Yeah. And, had a father he could look to with admiration. But, actually, so did Capone, kind of, if you will get down to it. So on some level, it does come down to choices, doesn't it? It really does.
Yeah, it does. Mm-hmm. Paul, did you have something?
Yeah, I just wondered, gentlemen, what was the interaction between Eliot Ness and the mayors of Chicago. You've got Big Bill Thompson and then Anton
Tony
Cermak. Where were they in terms of the transition between the machine Thompson and the reformer Cermak? Was there any interaction there?
Well, I speak a little bit to Cermak. I mean, Thompson was just basically a buffoon. I mean, there's nothing really. I mean, he's, you know, I won't go down that road, but there are people like that in politics today.
Not going to go down that river.
But you had with Cermak a guy who had his own ties to mob, and you know, I did a story called True Detective, no relation to the TV show, that in which Mayor Cermak's you know, anti-mob unit basically which was a two-man group who just went around and basically shooting the gangsters that weren't on Cermak's side. And one of the ones he tried to kill was have killed by his mobster squad was Frank Nitto, as we now know he should be called. And he learned, you know, you mentioned earlier that Nitto wasn't that tough. Well, he was tough enough to survive a bunch of bullets because they did not get him killed. And it wasn't very long after that a Sicilian killed Cermak in Miami. And a lot of people, I think, in Chicago, and a lot of historians at this point, believe that that's at least suspicious.
I wrote about that extensively. I did most of the original research on that. That Toohey, the guy I wrote about, worked with Cermak, and
Yeah.
it's in my book, and it's all laid out pretty clearly. I think I made a very good case for Zangar being a paid killer. He had a dope problem. There's a lot there.
And
Yes.
just
Probably wasn't a political hit.
Yeah.
We can rest assured.
He was a Republican and somehow got turned into a communist by the time they executed him, I think 2 weeks later, 3 weeks. He was defended by.
Wasn't Cermak the last Republican mayor of Chicago?
Oh, really?
I believe he was.
he was a Democrat, wasn't he? Cermak was a Democrat.
Yeah, he was. Thompson was a Republican.
Oh, that was the last
Yeah.
Republican. Yes.
But I'm just,
Here with his picture on the bottle. Did you know that?
You asked if Ness had a lot of interaction with the mayors, and I don't think he really did.
yeah, I mean, the only thing that popped to mind that's even remotely related is that we know that Ness was one of the people who was questioning Nitto after he was shot by Cermak's men. You know, I think the way Max phrased it when we were working on Scarface and the Untouchable was that we're telling the story of a general on the one hand and sort of a captain on the other, not quite a foot
That's a very
soldier.
good point. That's a
And
very
someone
good
who is, you know, I mean, he's federal, so he's not dealing necessarily. He certainly dealt with the Chicago police, keeping them at arm's length, of course. But it's not like in Cleveland where he's a city employee. He's working directly with the mayor. So it's, you know, again, getting that these guys were untouchables. They were outsiders. They were not someone you wanted to cooperate with if you were part of the political machine, I would think it's fair to say. And so Ness is going to be doing his own thing and trying to keep as much distance as he can from either camp. Would be my reading of the situation.
Yeah.
We focus on, just as everybody does, I mean, we focus on Capone and Ness as if they're equals, and they're equals in terms of popular culture, probably, or close to it, in their respective, you know, what they represent. But as Brad says, I mean, you have a general in Capone, and you have basically a captain in Ness. He just was a hell of a captain, okay? But so we use that to be able to cut back and forth between their two stories, because it's just a fun way to tell this story and show. But when you really look at it, it's kind of, you've got Capone up here with this stuff going on, and he's almost unaware of how he's getting eaten at, as you know, by Ness down below, by getting his money cut off. There's some question as to just how aware of Eliot Ness Capone was. He was probably aware of the Capone squad, as they called it. But whether he took it very seriously until they started really costing him, which they did, it probably was like a fly buzzing around him.
That's a good clarification. Thank you, Max. I find myself wondering. I mean, as you said, we equate the two of them as playing some sort of a chess game. But as you said, I mean, they were likely, Ness was much more aware of Capone until his bottom line began to fall.
Yeah, it's not Pat Garrett,
right?
Kid,
right,
you know?
Right, exactly.
You gotta look at the chronology, the
Yes,
timeline of it as
you're
well.
right.
You know, because the Ness Fraley book begins in 1929, claims that the Untouchables were formed in 1929, and started raiding right away. And some people have looked at the newspapers in 29 and 30, you know, and said, well, Eliot Ness isn't getting any press. You know, he's not doing anything. Well, in fact, the squad is formed as Scott, you know, found out in his research in late 1930. They really only start raiding in March of 31. The first indictments come down in June.
Yeah, Capone goes away
to
in
trial in October. And there's that period. Right, in the summer and into the fall, and then especially into 1932, after Capone is convicted, where Ness is mentioned in the headlines. The Untouchables are very active, doing a lot, as we talked about earlier, doing a lot of damage to the outfit's cash flow at a time when the Depression is also a serious problem for them. But that's all after, you know, unfortunately, as Max said, these things don't shake out the way you would like in a fictional narrative.
Right.
So a lot of the raids and the conflict happens after, Capone is already on his way to federal prison.
I mean, we have even faced that with our editor, who is a terrific editor, and but he'll ask, I'll say, can you do this and over here and can you do that, and we just have to say, but that's not the order of events. I mean, and so we don't do it. But it's tricky, because one of the things we've tried to do in these books is to make them very reader friendly, to make them, we often get told that that it's history that reads like a novel, and that, I think, was our goal from day one.
Let me ask Brad, because we covered Max and Scott, we know your background. How did you come to this? You a Chicagoan?
No, I'm from East Lansing, Michigan, where I am zooming in from. I grew up really a fan of Dick Tracy. I wasn't old enough to see the Warren Beatty movie in theaters, but I saw it on VHS. And that led me to the Chester Gould comics, which led me to the movie novelization that Max wrote, the audiobook of that. It was the first book of his I read, even though I listened to it. Yeah. I, like he did, some years before me, wanted to know more about the real history behind this, not knowing yet that, what he had found out, that Dick Tracy was very explicitly based on Eliot Ness. But I read more of his books. I read the Heller novels, the 4 Ness and Cleveland novels that Max wrote in the 80s and 90s. And that, led me to correspond with him. We got to know each other around the time that he did a one-man show in Des Moines that was filmed, is now available on DVD and Blu-ray, I believe, called Eliot Ness and Untouchable Life.
Max?
That he thought was going to be his final word on the subject, until I talked him out of that. Yeah, but I had this experience where I would read the novels that he wrote, and he would always put an afterword in there that was talked about the sources that he used and what was based on fact and what was, artistic license. And then I would compare it to what had been written in, books that were labeled as nonfiction and were not as rigorous in their scholarship. And I became sort of interested in this disconnect, seeing the need to, put some of this research, this understanding of who the real Eliot Ness was, because he had been so mythologized by Hollywood that this counter myth had sprung up with some help from people like Frank Wilson and some revisionist historians along the way. That Ness was a nobody. And the pitch that I made to Max was that we needed to correct that. That we needed to put this research.
As Brad will tell you, one of the things is that I had a lot of people borrow from me. Well, some were borrowing for fiction, but some were actually using my research in nonfiction books and not crediting me. I mean, those scrapbooks that you mentioned, Scott had laid fallow for many, many years until I found them at Case Western Reserve Library, and held those postcards from the Mad Butcher in my hands.
Allegedly.
And
The alleged Butcher.
the story that Brad knows so well is that it was very late in the day at the Case Western Reserve Library, and it was like 4:30, and I looked in the card catalog. Remember those? And I saw a thing that said literally Eliot Ness scrapbook. And so I requested it, and I waited and I waited and I waited, and I thought, gee, this is, they're going to close any minute. And a guy came up with a hand cart, these gigantic scrapbooks, I forget, a half a dozen maybe, and it was amazing. And that opened the whole world. That was the initial research, and that informed the 4 novels I did about Ness in Cleveland, and a lot of what I did in the Eliot Ness, or in the Nathan Heller novels. And so I began to kind of resent it when the stuff that I discovered would be, and talk about in my book, in my fiction books, would appear in these nonfiction books, and I wouldn't be credited. And Brad basically said, well, if you want to be credited, you better write the nonfiction book.
Yeah.
So we have, and I really do feel, and the research that Brad has done on these books beyond what I did.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like I built the basement and he built the house. That's kind of how I look at it. But he went all over the country doing research, and he found all kinds of things. He even met the grandson of one of the Untouchables, is what I heard. And I feel very confident, with absolutely zero modesty, that these 2 books are the definitive treatment of Eliot Ness.
How do y'all feel about Fraley, looking back? Is there, when you look back at the original teller of the tale, when you look at Fraley sitting there with Ness and his story that has trickled down, and you look back at sort of what you have done to filter it, what are your feelings towards him?
I love the show, and the irony, which again I think Brad would back me up on this, is that the original 2-part film, which was basically an unintended pilot film, is probably the most faithful, accurate depiction of Ness in Chicago with the Untouchables. Far more than the David Mamet scripted film. Far more than the later TV show. Anything. It was. Now, what happened was they used the whole book up in those first 2 things, and they just started making stuff up for how many years? 4 years, and starting out by having it. And this is, he mentioned, how mad Hoover got when Ness was getting credit for, Ma Barker, which was a big FBI case.
Yeah.
And so after a while, the idea that Eliot Ness is getting Waxy Gordon and all this kind of Mad Dog Paul. I mean, this is why people got really upset. And so
well, I would only add, if I could, that I think I've made it very clear that I think the original Ness Fraley book gets a bad rap as far as accuracy and fidelity to history is concerned. Yes, it's a nonfiction novel, but it plays fast and loose with chronology. There's certainly, as was alluded to earlier by Max, Ness did not want people to know he'd been married 3 times, so he misleads Fraley into thinking he met his 3rd wife back in Chicago. But it was based on really solid research. This 21-page manuscript that Ness wrote, which in and of itself is not complete. Ness may have written some other things that have not survived. Certainly Fraley, as we sort of begin the second book, talking about this time that they spent together in Coudersport, Pennsylvania, home now of the Eliot Ness Festival, where Fraley would interview him and Ness just couldn't remember. And, because by that time, he had a heart condition. By that point, he was probably drinking too much, more than was healthy. So his memories were just scrambled. He couldn't remember the chronology. He couldn't remember details. But there are little bits and pieces that, as Scott said, with his grandfather in the second book, that work their way in, that check out, whether from the scrapbooks or other sources. There's one of the more famous incidents in the book that I would have guaranteed you when we began. I would have bet the advance that this was a fictitious circumstance. Is that the Ness and the Untouchables just had to move all these trucks, these beer trucks that they had confiscated from the Capone outfit, from one warehouse to another. And so Ness calls Capone on the phone and says, look out your window at the Lexington Hotel at 11 a.m. the next morning, and you'll see something interesting. 11 o'clock rolls around, and all this parade of trucks, coming down South Michigan Avenue. And there's no newspaper account. But I talked to people who, one, for instance, his grandfather, I believe, was a crime scene photographer who recalled watching that two-part show in 1959, and his grandfather laughing and saying, this is all phony, but the parade of trucks, that happened, that's true. Scott can perhaps speak to that because he has even more direct evidence of that than I do.
I've gotten to know the family of Marty Lahart, who was one of the Untouchables. And in fact, Marty Lahart's wife and my grandmother for a while lived together in the same retirement community in Sonoma, California. And Marty Lahart's daughter told me, without me giving her any lead-in, she told me that her father told her the truck parade story. And I just said, well, was that before the book and the TV show or after? And she said, oh no, it was before. So she had and she even added some details to the story, some details that checked out with some of the details of the prank in the Fraley book. And then she added some details that weren't in the book. And so that was sort of one of those great corroboration moments that you hope for when you're doing research. But I think in a way we have Fraley to thank just for the fact that we're having this conversation right now. Mm-hmm. And my grandfather died when he was 44. He was 46 years old, the day before D-Day in 1944. But my grandmother lived to be almost 100 years old. I was very close to her. And when I was a teenager, I went out to visit her in Sonoma, and we went to the Sebastiani Theater, the single screen movie theater in Sonoma, and saw the Kevin Costner movie, The Untouchables. And that was when my mother said, your grandfather was one of those Untouchables. And my grandmother was laughing. She said she thought it was all kind of silly. And of course, I asked my mother what everybody now asks me, which one was my grandfather. And she said, well, actually, none of the agents in the movie were the real ones, but she said the real story is a lot more interesting. And we went back to my grandmother's house, and my mom took me into her bedroom and into my grandmother's clothes closet and reached up on a shelf and took down a shoebox and took out a .38 detective special Colt revolver, which we have in the family, which is the service revolver that my grandfather used as an Untouchable, and his heavy metal handcuffs with the heavy iron handcuffs that he had, and his shoulder holster. And it's funny because if you go on eBay, you can buy a toy set of those exact items with the Untouchables name on it. But I have the revolver, the handcuffs, and the holster. But that was sort of what sparked my fascination with that family history. And then, years later, after I became a federal prosecutor and knew more about history and uncovering the past, I started to look for some of the facts about the agents.
And Scott was really, as I've said before, instrumental, and along with Barbara Ostika at ATF, in uncovering the personnel files that are what, take these characters, these Untouchables, who are characterized in the Fraley book, but in many cases are little more than names, and put some meat on those bones and lets us talk about them as human beings. But but that just made me think. I mean, it's like Max said earlier, that this stuff has become so mythologized, and it's easy to forget that it was front page news. And one of the things that collapses all that distance in time is when you see those artifacts, like your grandfather's handgun, or I early in the research for the book, I held in my hands Ness's, as Scott knows, official credentials. The badge, not the badge, but the FBI folder that he would have carried on raids. There are two of them that are at the National Law Enforcement Museum in Washington, D.C., which you can go see when we're not in the middle of a pandemic. We both, during the research, and then later on when Max and I did an event at the Mob Museum in Chicago, or not, in Las Vegas, excuse me, we got to hold the Tommy guns that were used on February 14th, 1929 in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, which we know because of the ballistics work that Calvin Goddard did, connecting the bullets that were found at the crime scene to those guns, and one of the first instances of ballistic science, used in the United States. So Ness is a law enforcement pioneer, but he's not the only law enforcement pioneer, certainly in this story. When you're holding that in your hands,
Gould studied with Goddard too, and
so when you're holding that submachine gun in your hands,
it's possible that Ness and Chester Gould actually bumped into each other. I mean, having no idea what the significance of that was. But Scott, your story to me shows us that this is real life. Okay, this isn't myth. I love the idea that there's a shoebox and it's your grandfather's shoebox and you open it up and there's this stuff in there. That makes it so real, and I do think that that's one of the things that we have tried to do in this book that I think is maybe seldom done in this kind of book, which was to put some flesh on the bones. To anytime we had a detail of anything that was sort of real and real life, something like when you talk about the fact that your grandfather made made your grandmother wear the apron. See, that's people, okay? That's not myth. That's day-to-day. It's not headlines even. It's people.
Yeah, for sure. Brad, Max, and Scott, we always try and keep it to an hour, but with you gentlemen, we have blown that away without even realizing it. There's just so much here to say. I think we could probably do another couple hours with the three of you. Hopefully you'll come back. I just want to thank the three of you. The book looks wonderful. Scott, your story about the shoebox is just a perfect coda for this conversation. And I would like to thank you both all three of you for being here. A great conversation. Totally lost track of time. But I'm sure that our listeners are going to hang out for this one because it's a really great story.
Gentlemen, thank you for inviting us. And Scott, it's an honor to meet you.
Great to finally meet you too, Max.
Paul, not that I'm not honored to meet you other guys, understand. But if your grandfather wasn't an untouchable, I'm not that impressed, okay?
No. He worked in a shipyard. Nothing important here.
By the way, tell our listeners, our viewers, there'll be a connect to on all of our mob sites, the New England Mob, New York Mob, the I've forgotten our Chicago Mob name, Underworld, Killers, Clowns, and no, there's so many I'm losing track. And on all of our blogs as well, and on my personal blogs as well as my Fitzgerald blog, because it kind of fits there. So you can get the name and so forth. It'll take.
And I'll have links to buy the books in the descriptions down below.
Yeah, it'll go right to Amazon. And
thank you so much, guys.
This has been great. Anytime.
Thank y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.